Literally every single one of us has someone in our lives who will need care at some point very soon if they don't already, and they themselves will as well. This is a public problem, not just a private problem, because I think we all realize that we are all doing the very best we can, and the fact that we can't afford or manage or get access to the care we need is not, it's not a personal failure.
Maybe tell the audience, why were you compelled to do this work?
In terms of my connection to this work, I think if I were to trace some imprints that mattered, one would be being raised in an intergenerational household and having such a strong tie to my grandparents. So when they started aging, it was something that I really thought about and cared about and was involved in figuring out how they could live a good life for as long as possible. And I really felt like they gave me so much of mine, and so the idea that they would age well was something that was just really important to me, and have the care that they need, right, was really important to me. And then when I moved to New York City, I became really involved in the Asian immigrant community as a student. I just started volunteering, and I realized how many women in the community are working incredibly hard. And they were mostly doing kind of a set number of jobs. They were either working in nail salons or in restaurants, some in garment work, and then a lot of people working in care as domestic workers, as home care workers. And I just was so struck by how many women are working incredibly hard, like more than full time, and doing everything right, and still not able to pay the bills, still worried about making rent, putting food on the table, affording childcare themselves. And the fact that so many people are doing work, especially women, that is essential, right? The pandemic showed us just how many of these jobs are actually essential jobs to our safety and our health, and they're not enough to make ends meet. And immediately was drawn to the care workers who do work that make so many lives better and so much possible in our economy, and that was some of the least paid work and the most insecure work. And at a certain point, that observation and the reality of caring for my grandparents and really struggling with finding good care for them was sort of the place those two perspectives came together. And I just realized, well, if this is happening to me, there must be more people who are impacted by this challenge in different ways. And what would it look like for us to come together and share stories so that we could actually create a new story about how we value care and how we take care of each other? And I've just been on sort of different versions of that journey for almost 30 years now, and it's been a real privilege.
What was your first moment of convening? So you had that very powerful personal story that inspired you to act. And then what was that first formal mobilizing function? Was it a community based? Was it with friends? Did you come across people was or through what you were a part of in college where you saw others experiencing it? But how did you make that sort of first step into more formally organizing this effort?
I think there were a group of us who were volunteering at an organization called the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence, and we wanted to work with women in the community and wanted to focus on creating more economic opportunity for the women in our community. And we started doing these workshops on knowing your rights and also health fairs, different kinds of events in churches around the city, especially where lots of Filipino women go to church every Sunday. And it was always the domestic workers that would come to these events. And I think it was maybe a combination of the fact that we were in a space that was very familiar to them, their churches, but then also the isolation of domestic work is really real. You know, you're just one person in a workplace all day, and oftentimes nobody knows you're working there except the people that you care for or that you work for. And there's no other colleagues, there's no water cooler. So the idea that it would be important to come together in community with others who share your experience or do the same work as you seemed like a natural thing that would be good to break out of that isolation. And so Yeah, I was always struck by how it was always the domestic workers who wanted to come and were ready for the next thing, and that sort of set me on the journey.
When you did that initial outreach, was it word of mouth? Are you doing things in different languages? Like, how are you even and are you thinking about that at that point? Because I don't know whether you realized it, but you were starting a movement, right? So how were you actually thinking about it at that point?
It's so funny. It like, when I think about it now, there were no cell phones. It was even pre-pagers. I don't know if you had a pager, but I definitely had a pager. I don't know why I needed a pager, but I had a pager and a pocket full of quarters, and I would make flyers. We would make these flyers that were just so analog and so not designed. It's so basic. Here's the meeting, time, place, what it's gonna be about, and a phone number to call if you want more information. And we would literally go and visit all the Filipino churches, churches in the Asian American community, and just hand out flyers when people are showing up at church, when people are I'd also do a lot of outreach in the parks and playgrounds of Manhattan. So, for the listeners who know Manhattan, you know that in the playgrounds during the weekdays, you will often see many nannies with the kids that they care for coming to the park for some fresh air. And I would just go and hand out flyers there and talk to people and listen to their stories and take down their numbers in my little clipboard and follow up with them on a landline and invite them to the meeting, remind them about the meeting. And yeah, and then eventually we started a newsletter that same analog way where I would feature a story of somebody that I met. We would have more information about the next meeting, a little report from the last meeting, some other news that might be relevant, changes in laws or other things happening in the community. And I would just find different ways of reaching people. And I would try to show up and be more creative each time with another group of volunteers. And as soon as I could, I built a volunteer committee of nannies, and they also help to do outreach. And there's nothing like the power of peer to peer outreach when you're trying to build trust. And there's so many core principles of kind of meeting people where they are. It's all about trust and relationship and all of that that still remain true even if the tools are very different now.
What was your initial goal? Was it broad information or was there something very specific that you felt this community was getting deprived of? Whether it was broad information, data, or just awareness of rights, or they needed to create a community to kind of see where the resources were? Was there anything in particular from the beginning that drove you, or was it more about create this community so that there could be broader and diverse advocacy?
Well, I remember really early on hearing about cases of human trafficking, Filipina nannies who had been trafficked to the US by World Bank officials or executives in an international bank. They would get special visas to be able to bring their domestic workers with them. And that meant that the actual legal presence of the worker in this country was tied to their employer and their employment, which gave employers a lot of power. And there would always be kind of a rumor mill in the parks about who was being exploited and how somebody was not allowed to leave the house except on Sundays, and how somebody else was only getting paid $200 a month. Somebody else had their passports withheld. There would be these stories, and it just sounded to me like indentured servitude. And I was so shocked that this was happening in this time. It was the late 90s, and it was hard to fathom that this was really happening in our economy in this country. And so there were a couple of cases that we worked on where we filed lawsuits and tried to seek justice for workers who had been abused in this way. And in the course of that work, we realized that in a way, whether you are a victim of human trafficking or a survivor of human trafficking or a nanny whose employer forgets to pay them or consistently comes home an hour late and then an hour and a half late and then 2 hours late, that there's a way in which, because of the ways that we don't really value and respect care as real work, especially as a profession where people are relying on these jobs for their income to pay bills, to take care of their own families, and that they have their own families, that there was something about the mental model of domestic work that made everyone slightly vulnerable to daily forms of disrespect and certainly insecurity and precarity. Just about everybody I met in the park had some horror story about some point in their careers where they faced some form of abuse or mistreatment. And just the fact that it was such a Wild West environment where you just didn't ever know what you were going to get. And you might find a wonderful employer who you stay with for generations. And in fact, I just talked to our member, Gail Haywood, who was so excited about working for a family member of somebody that she worked for when she first started working as a domestic worker. And that familial intergenerational connection, how important that is to her and what it meant for her to get that job. So there are great stories like that. And then the other end of the spectrum and everything in between. And it just made me realize how many workers we rely on for some of our most essential basic needs, who essentially aren't really respected as equal workers, real workers, and what the implications of that were in people's lives. And it felt all of a sudden like a kind of once you see it, you can't unsee it. And then it just led me to think about all the family caregivers who are doing full-time jobs on top of caring, and all of the caregiving work they're doing is not visible and not supported, but it's so much of their life and so much of their energy and their contributions to society. And so the door opened a little bit, and all of a sudden it was a portal into a whole world of care that has largely been made invisible in our culture, but is actually just so profoundly essential.
Essential, and I would say without it, so much would fall apart, right? Looking around the world, are there models where this work is respected? It's not a stigma. These people are revered. And like, what is it about the values? Because we're really talking about a culture, the values in a culture which will either support or not. So where are they doing it right, if anywhere?
I think every culture is so specific in its context, but you often hear stories about Scandinavia, and one of the things that really strikes me about Sweden, for example, is that it is such a established cultural norm that everyone pays higher taxes so that childcare can be so widely accessible at such a high quality for everyone. And it's like an agreement that Swedes have made with each other and their future generations that, okay, we're all going to chip in so that this system can really work well for working parents, caregivers, and the kids who at such a crucial time in their lives have actual professionals and infrastructure to support them realizing their potential in life. Like, that's a cultural norm that Swedish people take for granted and are surprised when other people are impressed by that.
Because it goes to the question about what it costs to pay for childcare, right? And where then it becomes, we haven't talked a lot about this, but it becomes a gender issue, right? How do you balance childcare with work? And that tends to fall on women. Not always, but it's looking at that balance. And there's this whole other layer. And the expense of that is critical. And if you add any type of special need
Oh,
or other element. I have a son with cerebral palsy, and that was the most challenging piece of raising children. It was the childcare. I mean, I will say this, we have young women working within the company that are just have newborns, and they say it's so daunting, and it is absolutely the hardest part of all of this because of the infrastructure and the lack of it.
I'm so glad you named that. Yep.
When you look at building out care infrastructure, what does that entail as you've seen this? Because we look at this, I mean, I think you've articulated it so well that we don't appreciate this as a community, as a profession. And it is that labeling that creates the infrastructure. And so without that labeling, how do we find that? It's very piecemeal. People put it together in different ways. What do you see as the building blocks or what's critical for that infrastructure for domestic care workers?
Well, it's so funny you say this. I think about this so much. It's right now it's all a patchwork and we're all doing our best to piece it together. And it's the kind of situation caring for families, I think, where it is too profound a role and a project for us to be relying on individual families alone to figure out. And that is why the word infrastructure does come to mind so often, because it's when you have a system in place that you're able to imagine professionalizing a field of work and raising the pay so that people want to stay in that field of work, like in construction, right? When you have infrastructure jobs in construction, and those are, well known to be very well-paid jobs for a reason. It's about our shared economic well-being and prosperity as a country, and so is care, but we just don't see it that way. And what that means is, for the young parents in your team, 1 out of every 4 moms goes back to work within 2 weeks of giving birth in our country because of the lack of paid family medical leave at the national level. When I tell people in the UK that we don't have a national paid leave program, they have a 6-month paid leave program. And I know so many moms in the UK who literally say that that made all the difference for them in terms of their participation in the workforce, their ability to sustain in the workforce, and also be present for their kids at such a crucial time in their lives. And it's so obvious in a way, but we should have paid family medical leave. And we're one of 2 countries in the world that don't have it. So that's an obvious piece. Having affordable childcare policies that allow us to invest in a workforce, allow us to make childcare more affordable. And then I think, a lot of people think that Medicare covers long-term care in our country until you actually need it, and then you realize, wait a minute. And what we have is a whole bunch of families, and you know this, Kirsten, it's so many families, especially families with loved ones with disabilities, are reliant upon Medicaid. So many older adults are reliant upon Medicaid for essential care services because they can't afford to pay for them out of pocket. The average cost of nursing home care for an older adult is about $100,000 per year, and 60% of people working today in America earn less than $60,000 per year. So the numbers really don't add up when it comes to care, which is why we need shared solutions. And it's not about the government handling it. It's actually about leveraging our shared priorities to build the kind of infrastructures that give us the potential to handle it ourselves. Right now, we're just out here when it's not really working.
You said something earlier, we have to tell these stories. What is the story we need to tell? You just mentioned Sweden, for example. Somebody there is telling the story that taking care of children is a good investment. It's something you might consider investing in. Like, what story do we need to be telling so that people are getting it?
Right. I would say, and I want to credit my friend Larry Katz, who is an economist at Harvard. He always talks about investing in care as a triple dignity investment. And so, for example, when we make the job of a home care worker a better job by raising her wages and making sure that she has paid time off and good working conditions. Right now, the median income of a home care worker in the US is $23,000 per year, which is not enough to survive. And yet we have 6 million direct care workers who go to work every day, and it's a calling. They're not doing it for the money, right? It's a calling. When we make those jobs better paying jobs that people can really sustain in and support their families on, we're not only helping those workers and their families achieve a level of economic security, but we're supporting the people that are in their care, whether they're young children, people with disabilities, or older adults, to have a quality of life that is only enabled by having access to care. And then we're also enabling the working parent and the working family caregiver who relies on those services to participate in the workforce. So it's like the ultimate win, win, win of an investment, if we wanted to look at and it's not like something that impacts it's not like some special interest. Literally every single one of us has someone in our lives who will need care at some point very soon if they don't already, and they themselves will as well. And so this is really not even just an investment in sort of managing for risk. It's an investment in all of us, in each other. And I believe that policies like care policies are really a promise that we make to each other and to future generations that we care and that we are committed to allowing for the dignity that comes with being able to care for yourself and your family, that is a fundamental part of the American contract, the promise we make to each other.
You make an interesting point before. You said it's not about the government managing this, it's how do we come and create a collective movement.
Yeah.
And you're also talking so thoughtfully about a cultural shift, right? I mean, this is for whatever reason, we don't have a culture that invests and prioritize taking care of one another in this way. And to your point, everybody has an experience at some point in their life, either needing to be taken care of, taking care of a younger generation, an older generation. It doesn't matter how long, because in those moments, they are so significant and you're managing the balance. What are the tools and the elements of creating that movement? How can communities mobilize around setting the groundwork and the building blocks for that shift in what's required?
The first thing is really talking about the caregiving experiences that we have and making it visible in our lives and in our communities in a way that it currently isn't.
Yeah.
And I think it's starting to happen. I'm in touch with thousands of caregiver support groups around the country, and these spaces are incredible spaces of resilience and of mutual support. And people are starting to break out of the isolation of the caregiving experience to find each other, and that is the most important thing right now. And I often tell people, one thing you could do is just call somebody. Everybody knows somebody who's currently in the thick of caregiving, whether a new parent or somebody whose parent just got diagnosed with dementia or diagnosis of cancer in the family, and to just call that person and say, "Hey, I'm thinking about you. I know you're in the thick of it right now. Is there anything that you need? Like, what would it look like for you to feel supported in this time in your journey as a caregiver?" And just like every time I talk to people about that simple act of care, um, a light bulb goes off, because then they realize, wait a minute, I know so many people who are in this position, and it deepens the connections that you have to those people, and it ends up being such a gift. The act of reaching out to offer support ends up actually being a gift to the person who offers, because you're essentially being given the opportunity to show up. That gives back.
Yeah. I think what's so powerful about what you're saying too is when we see a problem of this magnitude, it feels very overwhelming and it covers so many demographic groups, which you've laid out so well, whether it's taking care of children, taking care of parents, spouses, where illness starts to come into play. And when you look at that as a magnitude, as a profession, that diversity and complexity feels overwhelming. It's like, how do you start? But it's a reminder that it's really one person at a time, one story at a time. The communities are built through leading with the kindness of connection, and the connection helps to grow that. Where have you seen what you're talking about and that value of picking up the phone? Where are some of the success stories, or it's not even but just that sense of growth and opportunity? Any stories that you've seen that have been particularly powerful for you to see this can work, we can all build this together?
Oh, I have so many stories, so many stories. Everything from Washington State, it started with a group of home care workers who started organizing and unionizing several decades ago. But that Washington State Home Care Workers Union has been able to establish the profession with a starting wage of $24 an hour. They have built a training institute that trains 40,000 caregivers per year. It's the second largest training institution or second largest educational institution in Washington state after the University of Washington, which I love. And that paved the way for so many partnerships with older adults and disabled people in the state of Washington that they were able to build a coalition to create the Washington Cares Long-Term Care Fund. So Washington became the first state in the country to create a long-term care benefit that helps people who are not eligible for Medicaid actually afford long-term care. So they started with workers and elevating those wages. Then they elevated the quality of the services through creating this training fund and these partnerships with people who rely on those caregiving services allowed for them to create this whole new piece of infrastructure of care and break through, create a whole national precedent in this country for a long-term care benefit. It's so beautiful how the communities of care inevitably grow. And then there's the micro examples of a care fellow who is a part of a program at Caring Across Generations called the Care Fellowship. He is a family caregiver for his mom with Parkinson's, and he had a dream of being a screenwriter, and he left his pathway. He was finished graduate school in New York and was going to make movies, and his mom got diagnosed, and he moved back to the Midwest and is now her full-time caregiver. And now the two of them are writing a script together. And because they wanted to build community around them, they have launched an open mic series for caregivers to come and just have a platform to read things that they've written about caregiving or to share their stories and to just be together. And I went to the first open mic, and most of the speakers who stepped up were men who felt particularly isolated in their caregiving journeys. And all of a sudden, this caregiver, Brandon, opened up this space for community and everyone rushed in. There's 1,000 stories like that where caregivers inevitably build community and it only produces goodness. It's incredible.
Well, I would imagine it would because in order to be in this space, you have to care about people. I mean, that's what it goes back to the values, right?
Yeah.
I was thinking when you were just talking about this open mic, are there stories or films that you've seen or shows or books that you've read that are really starting to do this work as well? Because we know that that will have the impact that we need, right, to change things.
Oh, there's so many stories. Whereas a few years ago, I don't think I could have said that. And a few years ago, there were lots of very earnest documentaries, and not even that many. And now I'm seeing throughout film and television, scripted and unscripted, incredibly powerful, dynamic stories about care. I don't know, Kirsten, if you saw Out of My Mind, the
Yes.
Disney film. So
Yes.
powerful. Origin was a care story, Ava DuVernay's incredible film based on Isabel Wilkerson's book. American Fiction was a care story. This Is Us, I'm a huge This Is Us person. It gives you a sense of, my vibe. Um, the final season was really anchored by a dementia care story that was so powerfully and beautifully done. And we actually did a bunch of research with the Norman Lear Center in LA and tracked the audience behaviors as they were watching the show. And what we found, we actually have data that proves that when people see care stories in their popular media, it drives them to share their own stories. So it actually catalyzes a behavior change, which is a change that we need. We need to make this conversation a public one.
Yeah, I love that you just referenced the Norman Lear. We've done a lot of work with them over the years as well. They're a wonderful, anybody who's watching, they've done so much work in making sure that these really important issues are put in front also of writers and showrunners and directors and actors, because that is the big way we can impact change in culture. Fantastic that you're doing that work alongside John.
Yeah, it's actually one of the reasons why I moved into this space because I've seen how policy people get mobilized and connected to stories when they can see parts of themselves in the stories that are out there in mainstream. We take things that don't feel mainstream, that feel very lonely, that feel very isolated, and by creating the stories about how this is done, what people go through, their experiences, you can start to create these movements. It does create behavioral change. We talk about it in very social media type of ways, like, oh, you see something and people will buy more of a product. But take that and really deepen it to the human connection, then people are mobilized. And I think that's, I mean, you're the thread of community that you continue to talk through is just so powerful because it's how can we create communities throughout our culture and create that connection where people don't feel alone.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a question for you about what did you do with your Genius grant?
I created a fellowship for caregivers to allow full-time care workers to take a leave from doing their care work to learn storytelling and advocacy and organizing, to be able to have the great privilege, which I have, to do this work full-time.
What's come out of that, and have you followed that? And we'd love a little follow-up around what the fellowship, is bringing for people.
In some ways, the greatest gift of the fellowship is the validation. I was a class of 2014 fellow, and at the time, these issues were not really understood the way that they are post-COVID. I think COVID put everyone into their own private care crisis, and then they realized, "Wait, this is a public problem, not just a private problem." Because I think we all realize that we are all doing the very best we can. And the fact that we can't afford or manage or get access to the care we need is not, it's not a personal failure. There's actually a bigger problem and challenge here for us as a country. And I think COVID really helped to bring that awareness forward. But at the time in 2014, I was just getting ready to publish a book, making the argument that caregiving should be a priority that we all invest in and we all support each other around. And so just having that validation, that kind of stamp of approval, you can get meetings that you couldn't get before. You could get taken seriously in a way that you might have been dismissed in the past. And that was really helpful at that time. It was a real turning point. And I would say that it created more visibility on the work of elevating caregivers and caregiving. And it allowed me to shine a light on other people in the space. And we've been building an ecosystem of advocates and organizers and caregivers and people who rely on care. And it's just grown so much. And I think that there are these little inputs that are not so little when it comes to a fellowship like the MacArthur Grant that really can make all the difference, giving you this kind of boost.